take turns reading as they chose, but I'll just be reading those so that it'll be on the video. Let's just talk a little bit about Daniel first. The main message of the book of Daniel is God's ultimate sovereignty over all earthly kingdoms and history. It's a book of prophecy, and we're going to see that it includes several visions that point to the coming Messiah. Daniel's also about hope and faith in the midst of exile, as Daniel remains faithful to Yahweh, and hope for the nation of Israel, that God is still in control, even though they're in exile in a foreign land, but he has a plan for their future. And he will tell them that through Daniel. As I said, it's a book of prophecy. The eternal, all-knowing God of the universe. In time past, he communicated with his creation through men who were filled with the Spirit of God. And they clearly heard his voice, and God told them to write it down. He told them things that would take place in the near and the far future. Some of the things that he told Daniel haven't even happened yet. We're going to see that it's future about our end times. These were things that would be absolutely impossible for Daniel to know or even imagine. Only a God who is eternally existent and omniscient could know these things. So this book is about God's sovereignty. Only he can see into the future. And he's in control. Even though sometimes it looks like things are totally out of control to us, right? He is controlling the destiny of nations, and he is in control of each of our lives. So, as we study Daniel, it will help you to understand end times prophecy. Now, there's prophecies about what's going to happen in the future in the New Testament, in the Gospels, and in Revelation. And you really can't fully understand them unless you've studied Daniel. Now, this book is unusual in that it's written in two different languages. Chapters 1 through 2, verse 4, the beginning of verse 4, are written in Hebrew. And then, from then on until chapter 7, it's in Aramaic. And then 8 through 12 are in Hebrew again. Hebrew was the language of God's covenant people, Israel. And Aramaic was the language of the Gentile world. So we're going to see that the book of Daniel has two major emphases. One has to do with God's program for the Gentile nations. And this is the portion that is written in Aramaic, because it was to the Gentiles for them to understand the future in their language. And the second major emphasis is on the nation Israel and the influence or effect of the Gentiles on Israel. The portions that have to do with Israel are written in Hebrew, the language of the Jews. Now, the book of Daniel is also a book of history. Daniel was a real person, and all of the events described in Daniel really happened. I'm going to show you a little bit of the historical background. So, just a minute, please. First of all, after the reign of Solomon, the kingdom was divided, into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And the southern kingdom was the kingdom of Judah. And this was in 931 BC. The northern kingdom consisted of 10 tribes, and they had just one wicked king after another, and who worshiped the idols. And so God warned them of impending judgment. In 722, the northern kingdom fell to the Assyrians. Their method of controlling conquered peoples was to exile the peoples from that land to other regions of the world and bring people from other areas into that land. And so that made it more difficult for the inhabitants to revolt against their rule. These foreign peoples brought with them their pagan worship practices and intermarried with the people left in the land. In the case of the northern land of Israel, they formed a district that was called the Samaritans. And so we all heard of the Samaritans in the New Testament. And this was a culture and a religion that was despised by the Jews because people had come from other lands and had intermarried with the Jews, and then often they had gone to worshiping idols. As I was looking at some of the history of the Assyrians, I found something absolutely fascinating. And I just have to insert it. Doesn't have to do with Daniel, but I thought it was really fun. We all know the story of Jesus and the woman at the well, right? In Samaria. I want to look to John chapter 4, verses 39 through 42. Now this is after Jesus has talked to the woman at the well, and and then she goes into town and she tells the Samaritans in the town all about what Jesus told her. 39 says, many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me all that I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his word. They said to the woman, it's no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is indeed the Savior of the world. Okay, because of one woman. If you look up Assyrians in the Wikipedia, Assyrians are still a people group. Not to be confused with Syrians. It's the Assyrians are still a people group. And they are in Iran and Iraq and in the Middle East. The Wikipedia says Assyrians today are almost exclusively Christian. Didn't that just give you chills? Because of the woman at the well, sharing her faith with the Samaritans and the Assyrians in that area, almost all the Assyrians in the world today are Christians. I just found that exciting. It's just wow. Yeah, that's crazy.
So just think about what one word or one thing that you might say.
That's right. That's right. If you think one person can't make a difference. So I just had to insert that. Now, we know that the southern kingdom of Judah had several good kings that led to the people led the people to remain faithful to the Lord for many years. But the kings became increasingly wicked, and the time for judgment came. God would rather have his people living in shameful captivity in a pagan land than living like pagans in the Holy Land and disgracing his name. And the prophet Jeremiah during this time, he repeatedly warned of impending judgment. And he actually said, if you look up Jeremiah 25:9, in his prophecies, he actually said that God called Nebuchadnezzar. That Nebuchadnezzar was going to be the one who was going to conquer them, and God called him my servant. He called Nebuchadnezzar, named him by name, and called him my servant. That he was going to be the one to execute the judgment. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, conquered the Assyrians in between 626 and 609 BC. I was going to pass out a map, but I got it from a study called Precept Upon Precept, and it's copyrighted. So since we're putting it on YouTube, I can't give it to you. I'm sorry. But I do want to tell you some about the history, so you can kind of get in your mind where we're at in actual history. So we're going to look at the historical setting of the book now. So I said Nabopolassar was the ruler of Babylon from 626 to 605 BC. His son was Nebuchadnezzar. And as he was a young general, and he was entrusted to lead the Babylonian army against Egypt in 606 BC. Pharaoh Necho of Egypt joined with the Assyrians, and they went against Babylon, but Nebuchadnezzar led a surprise attack, and he defeated Pharaoh Necho. And this was actually prophesied by Jeremiah in Jeremiah 46, 25 through 26. Nebuchadnezzar came to be feared throughout the world. When he invaded a country, defeat was certain. After a victory, the Babylonians usually took the most talented and useful people back to Babylon, and they left only the poor behind, to take whatever land they wanted and to live peacefully there. This system fostered great loyalty from the conquered lands and ensured a steady supply of wise and talented people for civil service in Babylon. There were actually 3 sieges, and I've kind of tried to put them here on the chart. If I can do this. I'll try to do this for the sake of this. I don't know how well this is going to work. Is it okay? All right. So, on his way home, after he conquered the Pharaoh Necho, on his way home, he lay siege to Jerusalem. King Jehoiakim submitted to him and was chained. And so here you see King Jehoiakim. Okay? He submitted to King Nebuchadnezzar, and he was chained. But then, while Nebuchadnezzar was there, he received a message from home that his father had died. So he released Jehoiakim, and he made him a vassal king. He plundered the temple, and he selected the most promising young men. So this is when Daniel and his friends were taken to Babylon. They were of the first, there were 3 different times when people were taken from Jerusalem to Babylon. So they were among the first. And this actually started a period of servitude of the nation. Jeremiah predicted it would be 70 years. So the 70 years began in 609 BC. Nebuchadnezzar then rode across the desert to claim the throne of Babylon, which he ascended on 6 September 605 BC. Then a few years passed, and Jehoiakim rebelled. There was a 5-year battle during which time he was killed, and his son Jehoiakim became king. I didn't put him on there because he only lasted 3 months. He was defeated in 597 BC, and he was carried away to Babylon, along with 10,000 captives, one of which was Ezekiel. And all the captains, all the mighty men of valor, and all the craftsmen and smiths, only the poorest people were left. You can read all about this in 2 Kings 24. He also took the remaining articles from the temple and put them in the temple of Bel-Marduk in Babylon. And then Zedekiah was put up as a vassal king. Zedekiah rebelled some years later, and this time King Nebuchadnezzar had had enough. He leveled Jerusalem in 586 BC. Jeremiah prophesied the defeat of Zedekiah in Jeremiah 32, 4 and 5. And it's interesting, there he says that Zedekiah will be carried away to Babylon. Ezekiel prophesied at the same time that Zedekiah wouldn't see Babylon. So Zedekiah laughed at both of them, and he said they couldn't even get their story straight. Interesting, when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the city, he killed Zedekiah's sons before his eyes, and then had his eyes put out before taking him to Babylon. So he went to Babylon, but he didn't see it. Prophecy fulfilled exactly. All right. Let's go back over here. So that's just a little bit of the history. How's that look, Wayne? Now let's turn to Daniel. Daniel 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So, here we are introduced to 2 kings on this historical timeline. It's the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, and it's 605 BC. And of course, King Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon. And he came to Jerusalem to besiege it. Tells us right here. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Now, Shinar is another word for Babylon. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths, without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. First of all, who gave Jehoiakim into Nebuchadnezzar's hand?
God.
It says the Lord did. That's right. Why?
Because they didn't follow in his ways.
That's right. Actually, you can read about that in Jeremiah 25. It says why God gave him into his hand. Because he warned him again and again. Actually, I wanted to take a break here and tell you a little bit about Babylon. Under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon became the most famous city in the ancient world. Its walls were 380 feet high and 85 feet wide. So wide that as many as 6 chariots could be driven side by side along the top. It was a perfect square, 15 miles on each side. And some say that it may have had a population of over 1 million people. So it was the largest city in the world at that time. And the Euphrates River flowed right through the middle of the city, so that it provided plenty of fresh water. But they also had provisions for that. They had some metal gates so that you couldn't get into the city from the river, but it went right through the city. Now, when visitors entered the city, they entered a long processional, and its walls were decorated with lions, and it ended in a huge gate called the Ishtar Gate. Now, in the 1900s, a German team of archaeologists excavated a portion of this wall and the gate, and they took them to Berlin. There's a museum there called the Pergamum Museum, where they reconstructed it. You can go to Germany today and see the walls of Babylon. We've been there. It's absolutely fascinating. And I have a little book I'm going to pass around that shows the walls. You can see the lions, and this is a portion of the wall, what the wall looked like. And all right, so just pass that around. These are some of the walls from Babylon. Oh, this one too. Here, pass this over. This is a little postcard. Okay. All right. Now back to to Daniel. Who was Ashpenaz? In verses 3 and 4.
He's the chief
Master of the eunuchs. What's a eunuch? Does anybody know what a eunuch is? Well, let me tell you about the eunuchs. A eunuch was actually a castrated man who was put in charge. Often they were put in charge of the harem. So, anyone, the kings had all these harems, and so that they would put men in charge, but they were castrated men, so they wouldn't be tempted. He was employed as a chamberlain in a palace. Isaiah prophesied that Hezekiah's descendants would be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Therefore, some commentators believe that Daniel and his friends may have been eunuchs also. We certainly never see any mention of wives. So they were in the king's palace, and they were in part of his government, but they were probably eunuchs as well. Daniel's probably 15, 16 years old at this time. Now I want you to think about a 15 or 16-year-old, maybe grandson, any 15, 16-year-old that you know of. Think if they were taken away from their home into a foreign land. Certainly, if Daniel and his friends were of the nobility, they had wives chosen for them. Okay, that's the way the Jews did. They had wives chosen, and so here they are in this foreign land, taken away from everything they know, and their whole future that they had before them is no more. So how many boys do you know of that age who would just would not be resentful, for one thing? Resentful that they were taken away from home and taken from all of their dreams, and yet they were so strong in their faith and had been brought up in the ways of the Lord that we're going to see that they remained faithful. Sorry, rid of that noise. Now in verses 5 through 7, what was the purpose of their training? What does it tell us was the purpose of their training?
So they could be the servants of the king.
Yes. It was to be in the king's service. So they trained the best and brightest of the youth they captured, and they immersed them in Babylonian culture. It was also kind of a brainwashing. They wanted to train them in the ways of Babylon and teach them all about their gods and their language and their culture, to take their old culture out from them. And then also, I read that they might be put into some leadership over the Jewish captives, and they would be more, then they would also indoctrinate them. But they would accept them more as their leaders, but then they would indoctrinate them as well. They learned the language, the literature of the Chaldeans, astronomy, mathematics, astrology, etc. And they were going to try to completely change their identity. And in so doing, they also changed their names into Babylonian names. Verse 5. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. So it's 3 years of indoctrination, and then they'd be tested. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. So all of their Hebrew names reverenced God. Daniel means God is my judge. Belteshazzar means Bel's prince. Bel is also called Marduk, and he was a chief Babylonian god. Hananiah meant the Lord shows grace. His new name, Shadrach, probably means under the command of Aku. He was the moon god. Mishael means who is like God. His new name is Abednego, and it means servant of Nebo, and he was the god of learning and writing. Verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Why would this food be defiling? You know why they didn't want to eat it?
Because they're not, because of the roots and the, what they learned at home.
Okay?
Because the food was offered to idols.
Right, exactly. The animals were killed in for Jews, the animals were to be killed in a specific way. And these had also probably been sacrificed to idols. It wasn't kosher. Refusing to eat the food served to him could have been seen as an act of rebellion. But he trusted that God would honor his obedience, and he refused to compromise in the face of great pressure. Notice that it says in verse 8, Daniel resolved. One version said he resolved in his heart. So he'd already decided. We see that he was raised so close to the Lord. He knew the Lord in a very personal way. And so he resolved in his heart that he would not be defiled, that he would still try to follow the Lord's laws in any way possible. But it could have been seen as a great act of rebellion, and he could have been killed. But we see he had great wisdom and courage. Now, notice in verse 9, I have to go back and forth with my glasses because my Bible's smaller print. Who gave Daniel favor with the chief of the eunuchs? God did, right. God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. I think that speaks volume. And it should also be encouragement to us. We can pray that God would give us favor with those who are in authority over us. That's an important prayer, that we would have favor, and then that God would then give them wisdom. Now, what was the chief of the eunuchs afraid of?
Couldn't be edited.
That's right. He said Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't hesitate to take his head. And he did that. With anyone who displeased him for any reason could be beheaded. And the chief of the eunuchs knew this. And so he was afraid to come against anything that the king had ordered. Now, verse 11. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this manner and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Notice how Daniel handled the situation in which he found himself. He looked for a compromise solution that would be acceptable to both parties. What great wisdom for such a young man. You know, it's just amazing. What was his solution?
Give us 10 days.
A 10-day test. Now, 10 throughout the scriptures is a number for trials or testing. The Mosaic law didn't designate any vegetables as unclean, so Daniel and his friends could eat any put before them without being defiled. So how did they do in their studies? Let's test. Let's see. As for these 4 youths, verse 17, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. All right, so how did they do in their studies? 10 times better than all of the others. Actually, just a minute. It doesn't just say that they were 10 times better than the other youths. Do you notice that? Look at verse 20. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in his kingdom. Wow. Not just than the other youths.
And many of them were older and should have been wiser.
Absolutely. Many of them were older and should have been wiser. Yes. So here we see these young men who've been taken captive from Jerusalem, taken away from everything. And as I was reading this, I was encouraged. Usually we think all about Daniel, but I think God also put his friends there with him so they could be an encouragement to one another. You know, it's sometimes it's harder to speak out on our own, but I'm sure that he and his friends had a prayer meeting. They said, "Hey, this isn't a good situation. What are we going to do?" You know, so they had a prayer meeting. They asked God, "What should we do?" And I think and God's the one that gave them the idea of what to do. And Daniel was the leader, and he was the one who was strong and able to speak up. And he's the one that God gave favor with the eunuch. And so they're able to go to the eunuch and say, "Hey, let's, here's just try this for me." And he decided, well, I guess that wouldn't hurt. Wouldn't hurt to try that. And so it's just amazing how God honored them as they were faithful to him. They were faithful to God's laws. Even though they were in a foreign land, they were young and on their own, but they stood together and were able to be strong and to speak out when there was something that they knew was against God's laws. There are many things that we find in our lives today that we see that are against God's word to do. Many things we may be asked to compromise, but we see that God is faithful when we could stand up and say, "No, that's not right. I don't feel comfortable doing that." And times God will honor that. He will honor when we stand up. I think many things that are wrong in the world today, even in our nation, are because God's people failed to speak up. And so, also, it struck me that, social media today is full of, there's a new word in the dictionary called influencers. So there's all kinds of influencers out there today. They try to convince us to act this way or to look this way or believe this way, and then you'll be successful or you'll be accepted, etc. And so they pressure us to conform. And I think God calls us to be influencers in a good way, into the ways of the Lord. we can teach people. So we're challenged to stand firm in our faith when we're faced with pressures and not to remain silent. And if we're not to participate in anything that conflicts with our values, etc. The same God who strengthened Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stands beside us today to give us strength, discernment, and wisdom when we're pressured to compromise. And he's going to bless our obedience. Right, now, what questions do you have about this? About Daniel 1 or about Daniel or history or anything?